Yes, I want to start by apologizing for, how I was in the last episode. I was a bit, frazzled by that story, and I do apologize for how I acted. Probably should not have, been filming when I was sick. I originally was going to do more episodes, but, Meg pretty much pointed out, "Gee, Susan, maybe you shouldn't be doing the web show when you're sick!" So I decided for the best I would wait until I was better. I mean, okay, maybe she didn't quite say it like that, but yeah. And some people were like, "Oh no, Susan, you're turning into Meg." It's like, I'm not turning into Meg. Yes, I may get a bit over the top with some of my reactions, but that doesn't mean I've gone insane. You gotta keep in mind, when I was on the old web show, I seemed more calm and collected, but A, that was a decade ago. I've changed. And B, I didn't read fanfiction on a daily basis and do a web show about it. I would just show up every now and then. So obviously, now that I'm doing it as the full-time fanfic critic, I'm going to be a bit more animated if I have an opinion about a certain story. And I'm going to show you a message that Meg sent me earlier today when I asked her how her day was going, just to show you guys that Meg is still a bloody nutter. I still don't know what that was about. It's cardboard. She's laughing maniacally, and then she shows cardboard, and then she looked like a bloody FNAF jump scare. See? I'm sane. I don't act like that. I did not act like that at all in the last episode. I did not go ha 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 in front of the camera. Okay? Okay. Meg and I are different. There you go. Speaking of Meg, today we're taking a look at 2 Sweeney Todd stories, and this episode is going to be different than my other ones because I'm going to be reading each story out loud to you. The reason being is that these 2 Sweeney Todd fanfics are very similar to each other. The first one I'm going to be reading is one that Meg wrote back before she was the fanfic critic. Back before we met, in fact. It's called Rest Now, My Friend. And the other story that we're going to be reading afterwards is called By the Sea, which this one was written back in 2019. Meg's story was written back in 2008. So, let's not waste any time. For her sake, I am not going to read her author notes out loud. I'm not going to make a habit of reading the stories out loud on the show either. The reason why I'm doing it in this episode, well, it's to compare the 2 stories because I found it rather curious how similar they were to each other, and then I want your opinions about it afterwards. Right, let's get started. Rest now, my friend. It has been 20 long years since I've walked among these streets. I stare at the sky that hovers ominously above London. Well, where else would the sky be hovering? It's just as grey as I remember it being. I walk down the streets, street silently, heading towards the local pub. I think I'll be needing a drink before I make my long due trip back to Fleet Street. Evening, sir. What can I get you today? The bartender asks me as I take a seat. Gin, I answer without making eye contact. I see him smile as he pours me a tumbler of the burning alcohol. I take the tumbler and take a good gulp. I stare at me drink as I remember the woman who used to give me this alcohol to me whenever I was upset. I close me eyes to the memory of her. Why is he speaking like a pirate? Feeling pent-up guilt radiate throughout my body. My body? I mean, I know they're supposed to be Cockney, but they don't say me all the time. Well, you bloody beaker. Sorry, Meg. I know you wrote this back when you were like 18, but still, I'm going to criticize it. I haven't seen your face around here before. You're new in town. The bartender, it should be one word, not two, asks me curiously. I once lived here long ago, I mutter. Ah, so maybe you've heard of the tale of the demon barber of Fleet Street. I look up at him, staring straight into his eyes. It's been many years, sir, I say quietly. He nods, understanding. Well, it happened 20 years ago tonight, at that old abandoned pie shop down in Fleet Street. Loud screams could be heard from that building. When the pie shop was searched, nothing was found. The barber shop above, however, was a gruesome sight, my friend. I stare ahead as I allow my memories of that night to come flooding back to me. What was this barber's name? I asked silently. If you're asking silently, this is what it would sound like. Oh, I'm sorry. You couldn't hear me, right? That's because I was speaking silently. Oh God, she's going to kill me after this episode. Wondering if I would be remembered. Obviously, you would be remembered if he's telling you the story of bloody... I'm sorry, Meg, I'm sorry. Oh my God. Sweeney Todd was his name. His shop was smothered with blood, but he was nowhere in sight. Neither was the lady who ran the shop below. I closed my eyes as he mentions her. What was her name? I reluctantly ask, acting curious. I'm sorry. Mrs. Lovett was the name. Nice woman. Met her a couple of times. The authorities think that Todd had killed her. Well, no shit. Although her body was never found. I bitterly laugh in my mind. Of course there would be no body, seeing I threw her into a blazing oven. Well, I think there would still be some remains, unless the oven was super hot, maybe a skeleton. It takes a lot to burn a human body. I'm not saying that from experience. Every night, the bartender would take the tender, merge them together, make them married, and have it be one word. The bartender whispers, getting closer to me. Agonizing screams can be heard from that abandoned pie shop at 10:09. Many say that's Mrs. Lovett who's screaming. I take another gulp of gin. Why is the G in gin capitalized? Trying to fight off the memory of me killing her. God, if this was Meg reviewing this story. It's supposed to be off, not off! Yeah, she's so gonna kill me after this episode. No one knows. The bartender... oh my God, every time I see that, I'm gonna scream. Okay, this is supposed to be reading so I can compare it to the next story, and here I am criticizing it. Okay then. No one knows. The bartender replies gravely. I finish me drink and leave the man his money. I get up to leave when he calls for me. I turn and face him. I never got your name, sir, he says, chuckling. I gave him a grave smile. The name's Benjamin Todd, sir. Good day. Benjamin Todd? Benjamin Todd? I say as I exit the pub. Over the years, I have changed into a man that seems to be a mix of Barker and Todd. I am like Barker because I am very remorseful for the crimes I had committed 20 years ago. Yes, but the thing is, Benjamin Barker, when he was Benjamin Barker, was not a criminal or a murderer. He was just an average bloke who ran a barber shop. I'm like Todd because I'm haunted by me past. My past. So I find it appropriate that my new name shall be a mix of me former lives. Well, you could have been a little more creative. I start to make me way towards Fleet Street. I feel me heart pounding when I make that turn onto the street that I had fled all those years ago. I keep thinking about her, not Lucy. She's been long forgotten and has been peacefully put to rest by my blade. No, the woman that won't leave me be is Mrs. Lovett. The second I threw her into that oven, I felt regret. Part of me wanted to pull her out and beat the cruel flames from her body, but I did not save her. I let my pride and my bloody vengeance blind me that night. I was too blind to see her reasonings for keeping the truth from me. She had been right about Lucy, but I wouldn't see it. I take a breath when I see the looming pie shop in front of me. The words Mrs. Lovett's meat pie still reside near the top of the building, although the letters are very faded due to neglect and age. I cautiously enter the building, looking around the eerily silent shop. Everything looks just how I remember it looking. The only difference is that everything is covered by a thick coat of dust and cobwebs, and the building would be dilapidated. I remember that night when I ran through this shop after I had heard Mrs. Lovett scream. I was concerned about her, making me barrel down the stairs of the bakehouse. I have to bitterly laugh when I recall throwing her into an oven mere moments later. That was the thing about Sweeney Todd. He was too stubborn and harsh to see reason. He was also cruel. I will not deny it. I remember her admitting her love for me that dreadful night. I took advantage of that love by tricking her, making her believe that I understood and that I had forgiven her. I saw how her happiness morphed into realization right before I threw her in. The strange thing is, she could have grabbed onto me at that moment, but she didn't. She didn't resist at all. It's as if she allowed her own demise to happen. Shaking my head, I turn away from the kitchen area of the shop and head towards the parlor. I enter Mrs. Lovett's parlor, glancing at the long-forgotten book that is on her coffee table. She always loved reading. I look at the pictures on the wall, all of them smothered in dust. I find it funny that, as Sweeney Todd and Benjamin Barker, I never noticed these pictures before. Most of the pictures were of Mrs. Lovett's family or Albert. It was then that one picture caught my eye. I approached the wall, carefully taking the small frame off of its place. I brushed the dust off to get a better look at the picture. I freeze as I see intense eyes staring back at me. It's a picture of Mrs. Lovett, a picture that seemed to be taken shortly before my return as Sweeney Todd. I know this because she looks exactly like she did 20 years ago. Also, Albert is not in the picture with her. In all the other pictures that have her in them, Albert is beside her and she looks happy in those photos. In this photo, she has no trace of a smile on her face. Her eyes are tired and bitter. I feel uncomfortable as I look into the eyes of Mrs. Lovett. It's as if she's staring at me. Well, yes, I think I'd be rather bitter too if I poured my heart out to someone and then they decided to throw me into an oven. I mean, she did lie about Lucy, but him throwing her into an oven was a tad over the top. I place the photo within my jacket, studying the old piano in the corner as I do so. I know where I have to go next, but I'm reluctant. The reason is guilt, and maybe a bit of fear. Will I hear Mrs. Lovett scream when I enter the bakehouse? Will that oven be blazing when I open the bakehouse door? I take a deep breath and head towards the entrance of the bakehouse, which is open. I slowly descend down the stairs, staring at the door below. The silence is becoming more deafening. With some effort, I push the door open. No light from the oven greets me, only darkness and silence. It doesn't feel right to be in Mrs. Lovett's home, to be greeted by nothing but silence. She was always a lively woman, even right before her death. I light my lantern and approach the bake oven. I can feel my heart pounding in my ears as I get a closer look. I am now standing right in front of the oven. Yes, okay, can we get on with it, please? It is exactly how I left it. Only now the fire has long died. The only way, sorry, that was my bad, to see what's inside is to open the damn thing. Well, yes. I place my lantern down, and I attempt to unlock the door. I have a bit of trouble because of how old the thing is, but I manage to unlock it after a minute. Using all of my strength, I pull the door open. It makes a loud screeching sound as the entrance becomes wide. I look into the oven, holding my light in front of me so I can see what's inside. My stomach goes cold. The racks that would hold the pies, it should say, the racks that would have held the pies, were resting on the oven's floor. The bottoms concealed by pure white ashes. I should just say I guess ashes, I don't know. I stare down at the ashes, shaking my head in disbelief. No one ever thought to check the oven when they were investigating me crimes here. I know the oven wasn't touched. I remember how the racks fell when Mrs. Lovett crashed into them. I carefully remove the racks, tossing them carelessly, well, that's a contradiction, behind me as I stare at the heap of ashes in the oven. There's absolutely nothing left of her. They just left the oven to burn until there was nothing left to feed the flames. I stare sadly at the remains of Mrs. Lovett. No wonder she haunts this place. Her remains were never put to rest. I turn towards me bag and open it up. I dig through until I find a decently sized container that has a tight cover on it. In silence, I fill the container up with the ashes of Mrs. Lovett. When I get every single ash inside, I put the cover on tightly. I hold the container close as I close the oven door and lock it once again. Holding the container in one hand and the lantern in the other, I turn and leave the bakehouse, forever this time. In mere days, I find myself standing at the edge of a cliff that faces the roaring sea. It's oddly sunny out as I look up at the sky. At times, I wonder if London is always cloudy while the rest of the world is pleasant. I take the container, Mrs. Lovett's ashes, out of my jacket. I open the lid and pull the ashes out, watching them gracefully fly towards the sea. Rest now, my friend, I say quietly. I realize now that she was my friend, not those cursed razors. My eyes follow the ashes as they drift further and further away from me. I smile slightly as her ashes disappear completely into the distance. She always loved the sea. I reach in my jacket and take out a picture of her. Funny, she doesn't look as miserable as she did back at the pie shop. I hold the picture close to me as if I'm hugging it. I forgive you for your foolishness, my love. I'm sorry for being equally foolish, I whisper. I take a couple of steps backwards from the edge. I open my eyes and stare ahead. I break into a run, and I leap off of the edge of the cliff. I feel light when I hit the brutally cold sea. I allow it to drag me down and suffocate me. Before I die, I take one more look at the picture of Mrs. Lovett in my hand. The last thing I see is her smiling at me. Right, so that's Meg's story. Let's take a look at the other story. By the Sea. The author is Project Mayhem 7. This one also, was Meg's rated T? Yes, hers was T. Hers is tragedy angst. This person is romance angst. Meg's story was over 2,000 words. Theirs is 1,300 words. Meg's was written back in September of 2008, and theirs was written September of 2019. So this story was written 11 years later. Right, let's not waste any time. She had always wanted to go to the seaside. That much he remembered. Though he hadn't paid much attention to her ramblings, that was the one thing he had retained. Not that it was the only thing. Why, just a few days ago, he had been walking down the street past the flowers, and he heard her faint voice. Gillyflowers, maybe, instead of daisies? I'm sorry, I had to sing it, somewhat. He had stopped to buy a large bouquet of each. He had placed them in vases around the building. No doubt he would soon forget why they were there. After all, these recollections were becoming few and far between. He no longer heard the slam of her rolling pin on dough every time he passed the door to her shop. He no longer saw her reflection behind him in the cracked mirror. He no longer felt her hot breath on his neck as he tossed and turned at night, unable to sleep for thoughts of her. He dreaded the day he would no longer remember her warm brown eyes, her burgundy red curls, her whisper in his ear to wait. After all, those memories were all he had left. He had no longer remembered Benjamin Barker's life. Had that been his name, Lucy was but a vague blur of pale skin and yellow hair. Joanna but the cry of an infant. He barely remembered his revenge. Had he stabbed the judge violently in the neck, or had it been a clean slice? Had there been a lot of blood? He couldn't remember, but he remembered her. How ironic, really. He never paid attention to her when she was alive. When she was gone, he had tried his hardest to forget her, and now he was clinging desperately to every fragment of memory. And how odd those fragments were. A gentle lullaby he had listened to but not really heard. The deep blue of her dress when they had gone for a picnic. Her smile. The smile that she wore whenever he paid her the slightest bit of attention. The smile that greeted him every morning in her shop. The smile she wore when he danced with her. Why had she smiled? She had smiled as he pulled her to him for one last waltz before she had met her unfortunate end in a blaze of fire and smoke and screaming. She had known. He had seen the acceptance in her wide eyes. She had known what he was doing. She hadn't tried to escape. She had smiled and stepped into his arms, into the arms of death. He suspected that he would never know why she had smiled. He had never really understood her. But he did know one thing. She always wanted to go to the seaside. And so he took her. Took all that was left of her, at least. For the first time in months, he had descended into the bakehouse. He had walked past the now rotting remains of his last victims. Are the police non-existent in this universe? Past the bones of his first victims. He had gathered the ashes from the incinerator into a jar. The incinerator? It's a bloody oven, not an incinerator. Then he had walked up to his barber shop. All he had wanted from there was his friends. He didn't know why they mattered, but he remembered that they were important. He picked one up. The cold metal grew warm in his hand as he remembered something. It was a memory of her, as usual. He held the blade against her throat, feeling her pulse. A drop of blood trickled down her neck, between her breasts. She had been forced to take a seat in the chair she had called dear old Albert's, without a hint of grief of her dead husband. He spoke in a sing-song voice, taunting her. We all deserve to die. He had pulled himself out of the vivid memory. He traced the blade with his index finger. It drew blood. He felt nothing. He had looked up at the cracked mirror and seen a stranger in the glass. Perhaps he was only bringing what was left of himself as well. Now he stood on the dock, overlooking the vast blue-grey sea. Okay, apparently he can teleport. He pulled out the small jar of grey dust and ash and placed it on the ground beside him. He looked up at the black sky full of stars. Yes, he had come at midnight. He hadn't want people around him, chatting incessantly, jostling him as they rushed about on their meaningless errands. She would have found this amusing. She would have teased him. He could hear her voice now. Couldn't come on a nice summer day, could you, Mr. T? Had to come in the middle of the night. Suits your personality, you know, all dark and such like. He smiled slightly at the thought. He looked beside him at the jar of ashes, but it was gone. She was there in its place. She looked just like she had in life. Petite frame, pale skin, wide chocolate-brown eyes, dark red hair, the color of blood. She wore a simple gown of some silver fabric that swirled around her like waves. She smiled up at him, and this time he knew why. He smiled back. His face muscles were stiff from disuse. He hadn't smiled in years. He reached to hold her face in his hand, half expecting it to be met with some sort of cold mist, an illusion. But his gentle hand met warm flesh, and she reached up to hold his hand to her cheek. They moved closer, their foreheads meeting. You're here, he murmured. I always have been, love, she whispered back. But you're gone. He couldn't bring himself to say that she was dead. And I'm alive, aren't I? Life is for the alive, my dear, she reminded him. He smirked a bit at that. Are you really alive? I don't know anymore, he admitted. I don't feel alive. I don't feel much of anything, usually. She moved closer to him, if that was possible. Do you feel anything now? She breathed, her lips millimeters away from his own. Yes. And he closed the gap. Their kiss was deep and full of emotion. He didn't even know what emotion it was. It had been so long since he had felt anything. He decided that whatever it was, he liked it. They broke apart, anywhere from seconds to years later. He couldn't tell. He kept his eyes closed as they separated slowly. When he opened his eyes, there was nothing there. Nothing but the jar of ashes. So, from a passerby's point of view, they just see this random man holding a jar to his face, making out with it. Don't ask why I did that, and I probably should have been holding a jar, because that probably looked very bizarre from... Okay, enough of that. Back to the story. Sorry, give me a moment. This is where she lives, he realized. She had always wanted to go to the sea, and that's where she had been all this time, waiting for him, waiting until they could be reunited once more. He opened the jar and let the sea breeze carry the ashes down the waves, watching as they swelled in the wind and water. But they weren't reunited, he realized. Not yet. He let the wind carry him down to the waves, too. As the light and shadows all faded to black, a figure emerged, one he immediately recognized. It was her. He took her hand and walked with him out of the darkness. When the last shadows faded, they were by the sea again, this time together, this time forever. This time it wasn't just what was left of them. This time they were complete. Right then. Can you see why I thought these stories were similar? Yes, they were very, very similar. I wouldn't quite say this one was a copycat of Meg's story, but there was a ton of things that were so similar that it wasn't really a coincidence. Both of them are about Sweeney regretting killing Mrs. Lovett. Meg's story wasn't quite romance, though. It was more like, friendship, maybe. I wouldn't say romance. This one was definitely more of romance. There's a much bigger time gap in Meg's story compared to this one. Meg's story, it's 20 years. This one is just a few months. And them saying that his memory was so bad, I thought it was supposed to be a deal that it was going to be a lot of time, but no, it's only supposed to be a few months. The whole thing about her collecting her ashes in a jar, him bringing her to the sea. In both instances, he gets, dumps her ashes to the sea. I'm under the impression that he does die in this one as well. I don't know. I mean, they're very similar. I felt like Meg's story kind of dragged in some spots, and I felt this one kind of, rushed things too much. I mean, both of them were decent, but I do feel like this person might have been inspired by Meg's old story. But then again, Meg's was written back in 2008. So maybe not. I don't know. I mean, back when she wrote a lot of her Sweeney Todd stories, she was I wouldn't say a super, super popular author in the fandom, but she was decent, had a decent following. So, I don't know, maybe. I'm not sure if I should say I don't know. There's a lot of similarities. Let me know what you guys think. Yes. I wasn't originally going to, do these. Well, I wasn't originally going to review one of Meg's stories in today's episode. This was kind of an accident. I didn't really want to do any of the requests because I haven't had time to read those requests yet that I have gotten. Those stories are kind of long. So I wanted to do, a couple of Sweeney Todd one-shots. Because, that's how Meg started the old web show, by reading a Sweeney Todd story. And if you guys have noticed this outfit, doesn't it look a little familiar? That's right. It is a nod to Sweeney Todd. It's a Sweeney Todd Halloween costume. I'm not wearing the wig, obviously, because I'm supposed to be the FanFic Critic, not Sweeney Todd, the demon reader of Wherever We Live Street. So, I wanted to do a couple of Sweeney Todd fanfics, and when I came across this By the Sea story, I kind of was looking at it like this seemed awfully familiar, and that's when I pulled up Meg's old page, and there it was. So I'm like, you know what? I'll just do a comparison. So, yes, this is probably going to be like the only time I'll read an entire story out loud. I did it so I could let you guys see the comparison between the two stories. So let me know what you think. Do you think this person might have possibly plagiarized, or do you think it's just a bit of a coincidence? Even if they did, don't go after them for it. I would just recommend, if this person did, get inspiration, give credit where credit's due. And if they didn't, and if it's just a coincidence, then that's okay too. Because it happens, it does happen. Right. Well, thank you all for watching today's episode. If you liked it, please be sure to leave a like and leave a comment. And please subscribe if you haven't done so already. I would really greatly appreciate it. All right, then. You guys have a nice week. I will see you all next time. Until then, cheerio.